Coming to the shore of the Chesapeake Bay right now, one can find quite an unusual sight. People are tossing oyster shells into the water and onto the beach. It's okay to throw just one or two to have some fun or to pay tribute to the legendary bay, but no. Some organizations have been dumping tons of what's left of oysters into the waters of the bay and its tributaries every year for several decades. At certain times, you can even see whole floating factories on the horizon, which have only one goal: to process and dump as many oyster shells as possible into the Chesapeake Bay. Do you think this is waste disposal in one of the most famous bays in the U.S., which is currently in a state of decline? Of course not. It's all about restoration. As for what exactly is being restored and how oysters help with that, we'll figure it out now. The Chesapeake Bay used to have a lot of biodiversity. It had quirky blue crabs, many different fish like sharks and Atlantic sturgeon, turtles, dolphins, tons of oysters. There were also forests stretching for miles of underwater space. However, at some point, humans started their activities here, and as a result, all the local biodiversity faced serious challenges. Take a look at this map showing the population density of the United States. On the East Coast, the area around New York City has the highest population, as well as the Chesapeake Bay area. This is the watershed map of the bay. Here you'll find Washington, Baltimore, Richmond, Newport, Arlington, and many other cities with high population density. What does this mean? This has been the norm in the Chesapeake Bay area for a long time. Or this. Some kind of liquid is being dumped into rivers that flow into the bay or into the bay itself. It doesn't really matter because the bay suffers either way. With that contaminated liquid, nitrogen and phosphorus get into it. For example, agriculture is actively dumping water into the bay. In 2022, participants of the Chesapeake Bay program found that 48% of the nitrogen and 27% of the phosphorus load that flows into the bay comes from agriculture. From time to time, sewage and treatment plants have been added to the list of pollutants in the Chesapeake Bay. Yes, they're built according to a lot of standards, but all that compliance ends when heavy rains come. These cause the sewage to overflow, and the pollution ends up in the bay. As a result, in 2021, it was reported that treatment plants like the Back River and Patapsco facilities are responsible for 11% of the nitrogen and 15% of the phosphorus entering the Chesapeake Bay. Do you know what a dead zone in the sea is? It's an area in the oceans and large lakes where oxygen levels are very low, which means most underwater creatures can't survive there. So back in the 1970s, a dead zone was discovered in the Chesapeake Bay, one of the first identified on Earth. In 2010, it was estimated that local dead zones were killing up to 75,000 tons of bottom-dwelling mollusks and worms every year, weakening the base of the food chain in the bay. Because of this, for example, the blue crab loses its main food source. One of the main reasons for the appearance of dead zones is that very phosphorus and nitrogen, which get into the bay from pollutants released by humans. These elements promote the rapid growth of algae, which in the end blocks sunlight from reaching the bottom of the bay. The bottom vegetation of the bay dies, oxygen in the bay decreases more and more, and then, in turn, many other creatures living in these waters lose their food source, and that's how dead zones emerge. Right now, the vast area of the bay no longer has the biodiversity it once did. Less vegetation, fewer fish and other creatures, and often you can even come across a muddy wasteland. There is hope, though, and it lies in oysters. They act as natural water filters, having a very positive impact on the bay's condition. However, unfortunately, when humans began their active activities in the Chesapeake Bay, oysters were among the first to suffer. Over the last 50 years, their population's been literally wiped out because at some point, commercial harvesting started. Imagine, oysters were such powerful filters that before the colonists arrived, they could filter the entire bay in about 3 days. By 1988, this time had increased to 325 days. Once in the state of Maryland, which covers much of the bay, there were about 313 square miles of oyster reefs. But after a count in 2008, everyone was shocked because the area had shrunk to just 58 square miles. Along with the constant pollution, the decline of these creatures was exactly what led to the appearance of dead zones and turned the bay's bottom into muddy wastelands. But what if, let's say, we fixed the solution for natural cleansing? People figured out some options and started scattering oyster shells across the bay and its tributaries. But if you think it's enough just to toss oyster shells into the bay, that's not the case. The thing is, oyster shells and oysters are different. The shell's like a home or clothes for living creatures. Simply tossing the creature's clothes doesn't mean you're going to multiply that creature. Let's take, for example, how the population of underwater animals is restored by the efforts of the participants of Chesapeake Bay Foundation, or CBF. Every year, the foundation collects 4,000 bushels of shells through donations from restaurants and private individuals. A bushel, by the way, weighs around 50 pounds on average. So every year, about 90.4 tons of material is gathered for the restoration of the bay. This is just to give you an idea of the scale of the work. Then, tons of shells are processed, cleaned, and dried, after which CBS places them in huge water tanks containing millions of microscopic oyster larvae. Each of them attaches to a processed shell with many larvae on one oyster home. In simple terms, the foundation takes the shell and gives it to the young oysters, who claim it as their own and grow into adults. But before growing up, future adult oysters, along with their new homes, head to a place where they need to build a full oyster reef or expand an existing one. In other words, the foundation dumps shells into the Chesapeake Bay itself or one of its tributaries. After that, a new oyster reef forms, which helps filter the bay suffering from pollution. What are these objects? These aren't exactly oyster shells, but they're placed in the right spots in the bay to create reefs just like them. Meet reef balls, another method for restoring oyster populations. These balls have various angles, cracks, and holes for water flow with rough surfaces. In short, they mimic natural reef formations, which oysters love. They're created and then dropped into the water, where they gradually get covered with oysters, turning into a populated reef. But this method only works if there are already oyster larvae in the area. If they're not around, the CBF option is fine, which, before putting the balls into the water, fills them with larvae on its own. However, even just the balls without oysters are great for restoring the Chesapeake Bay environment, since they quickly turn into a habitat for fish, crabs, and other local inhabitants. And oyster shells without larvae are also useful because underwater creatures can use them as well. One way or another, restoration brings the desired results. For instance, in 2010, the health of the bay improved in terms of the overall state of its ecosystem. It scored 31 out of 100 compared to 28 points in 2008. In 2021, scientists from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, or UMCES, reported a slight improvement in the water quality of the bay compared to 2020. In 2023, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science rated the overall health of the Chesapeake Bay as a C+, which is the highest score since 2002. Overall, each of these methods has an impact on the overall condition of the struggling bay, but it's important to understand the scale of the efforts behind all these improvements. We already mentioned the Chesapeake Bay program today. It started back in the 1980s, just when people were starting to realize that the situation in the bay was getting worse. A historic agreement, Chesapeake 2000, was signed, setting 102 goals to reduce pollution, restore habitats, protect wildlife, and more. One of the goals was to restore oyster reefs. So far, the program's already achieved great success. For example, the Harris Creek Oyster Reef Restoration Site in Maryland is officially completed. People brought a bunch of oyster shells, dropped them in the water, and now they're watching what happens to them. As it's stated, 98% of the Harris Creek reefs meet the minimum threshold for oyster density and biomass. Almost 348 acres of oyster reefs have been restored there. In total, by 2023, 1,570 acres of oyster reefs have been restored in the Chesapeake Bay. That's about the size of 2,075 football fields. 11 tributaries have already been restored, during which local people could see shells falling into the water or the installation of quirky reef balls. In fact, 9 restoration projects have been fully completed, and there are still 2 tributaries left, with work scheduled to be finished in 2025. It seems like people haven't done that much in 40 years. But you can't just dump material for a future reef. The task is much more complex and requires a lot of different efforts. First, a plan for restoring the bay's flow is created, which determines the specific places where the reef needs to be placed, how it'll be built, the costs, and future monitoring plans. Then, shells need to be collected, processed, and populated with oyster larvae. Only after that do you place the shells in a selected spot, and even placing them's no easy task. This is explained by the fact that in some situations, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers even lends a hand. Of course, there are options that make the whole process easier. Once again, let's look at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which has a mobile oyster restoration center. This unique mobile facility is located on 2 connected barges which hold 6 tanks, each with a capacity of 845 gallons. It's here that oyster larvae attach to recycled shells or reef balls, after which they're planted on nearby reefs. The foundation claims that the barge is located on the same rivers where the oyster reefs are being built. This increases efficiency because there's no need to transport shellfish and balls populated with larvae from one place to another. Also, the floating factory doubles the oyster production capacity in Virginia to 15 million oysters per year. However, the mobile center from CBF is, as already mentioned, a unique object, so the process is usually much more complicated. This is also the reason why the results of decades of the reef restoration program don't really impress. There's also the nonprofit organization Oyster Recovery Partnership, or ORP, which is also involved in restoring the oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay. Overall, the methods aren't much different from what's done under the Chesapeake Bay program. Oyster populations are restored by recycling shells and then planting them. Moreover, ORP is also a partner in many projects that are part of the Main Bay Initiative. However, what's interesting is that this independent nonprofit isn't far behind the state program in terms of restoration. Since its founding in 1994, ORP has independently and in partnership planted over 10 billion oysters on 2,965 acres in the Chesapeake Bay area. In addition, ORP has achieved great success in shell recycling. It's now the largest network in the U.S. for recycling, collecting tons of material each year from around 200 restaurants and 70 public drop-off points in the Mid-Atlantic region. Since its founding, ORP has collected 300,000 bushels of shells, which, it's claimed, is enough to plant 1.3 billion oysters in local waters. Meanwhile, in the restoration effort under the ORP flag, there are a large number of volunteers, 2,000 people who grow oysters in 35 tributaries of the bay. It's also worthy of respect because sometimes it's a tough task to get people involved in activities aimed at restoring habitats. ORP is also working closely with scientists to figure out the best ways to grow and restore oyster reefs. And that's not the only organization. It's not even just 2 or 3. There are tons of organizations and individuals focused on restoring the filters of the Chesapeake Bay. So we figured out that scientists and volunteers are restoring the oyster population so they can clean the waters of the bay. But can't we completely eliminate the incoming pollution? Or at least partly, because removing it all would mean shutting down literally 100% of the local agricultural lands and industrial sites. Legislative restrictions, which do exist, are the only way this can work. Back in the last century, there were thoughts about making a resolution on the maximum daily load for the bay, which would set, for example, water quality criteria, standards for individual tributaries, and much more. The document had many problems, but in the end, the resolution was released and became the most complex document of its kind issued by the Environmental Protection Agency to date. Now the document requires all states in the Bay Area to develop detailed plans to reduce pollution. The plans are long and complex, including many pages filled with a bunch of points on various topics, so we won't list them. Among the various methods of reducing pollution, there are different improvements in pollution control, such as at treatment plants. It's also important to manage stormwater, like through infiltration basins or artificial wetlands. All of this should help save the bay from polluted water. In fact, this has become a requirement for most new construction projects in the Bay Area. Also, the states of Maryland and Virginia passed laws aimed at reducing the impact of lawn fertilizers by limiting the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus. And Virginia also banned de-icing agents, which contain these elements as well. In general, as we said, it's unlikely to fully eliminate pollution, but at least this is something. It's worth mentioning that the problems in the bay aren't just due to pollution, there's also erosion. They've been trying to deal with that too, which is clearly shown by the history of Poplar Island. Maps and records from the 1600s describe the island as land covering more than 1,976 acres. However, due to rising water levels, soil subsidence, and erosion, Poplar was disappearing at a rate of about 13 feet per year. By 1998, the island was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. Its area had shrunk to a maximum of 2.5 acres. There were birds, waterfowl, and other wild animals living there. For them, the island was either a permanent or temporary home, the disappearance of which would lead to unpredictable consequences. But the process was stopped. In the same 1998, restoration work began. Barges and dredgers were floating around collecting sediments that builds up in the navigable channels leading to the port of Baltimore. Then all of this was transported to Poplar Island, where it was mixed with water and pumped into separate containment cells, the building blocks of the island. The cells would dry, and once they looked like a cracked, drought-stricken landscape, they were leveled off to create the marsh's outline. Eventually, marsh plants were manually planted on the reclaimed land. Remember, the main reason for the destruction of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem is the rise of nitrogen and phosphorus levels. In the case of Poplar Island, a high concentration of these elements is essential. The sediment used for the island's reconstruction has a much higher concentration than the usually used sandy alternatives. This is important for growing the right plants and creating an island made of wetlands. Right now, a 1,139-acre island habitat has already been created. Another 568 acres are planned, so Poplar is still far from finished. But when it's done, Poplar will be half upland and half wetlands. Forests, shrubs, meadows, freshwater ponds, all of this will create a high-quality environment for a variety of animals. Wetlands will become a temporary or permanent home for fish, shrimp, crabs, diamondback terrapins, shorebirds, wading birds, and mammals. In general, the island will become a hub of wildlife, showing that even nearly lost land can be restored. Work on Poplar Island is another indicator of how important the Chesapeake Bay is to the locals and to the U.S. as a whole. Restoring islands, oyster reefs, all of this is hard and expensive, but still people are focused on bringing back the former glory of one of the country's most famous bays.